I want you to pause for a moment, not because this story is complicated, but because it is dangerously simple. 137 human beings were removed from U.S. jurisdiction, not after trials, not after hearings, but through planes, paperwork, and silence. This is not a legal technicality. This is a stress test of the American Constitution. When a government claims that the situation is fluid, what it often means is this: the law is being outrun by power. A federal judge ordered answers. The executive branch answered with geography. El Salvador, Venezuela, anywhere but a courtroom. And here's the question you should be asking yourself right now. If due process can be delayed for them, how secure is it for you? Stay with me, because this case is not about 137 people. It's about whether constitutional limits still function when power decides they don't. If this matters to you, don't look away. Let's unpack what's really happening. To understand why this moment matters, we have to define the problem clearly, without slogans, without noise. Let's be precise about what is happening. This is not a dispute over immigration policy. It is not a partisan clash, and it is not a debate about foreign affairs. This is a confrontation between constitutional process and executive improvisation. A federal court asserted jurisdiction. The executive branch responded by moving people beyond reach, not accidentally, systematically. The government was ordered to explain how 137 detainees would receive due process. Instead, it asked for time. More time, because the situation, they said, was fluid. But here is the structural problem. Due process is not conditional. It does not pause for logistics. And it does not dissolve when power finds distance. When a state removes people from judicial oversight and then argues that oversight is no longer feasible, the system begins to eat itself. This is why this case matters. Not because of who is in power, but because of what power is being allowed to do. To see how we arrived here, we need to step back and understand the deeper pattern that made this moment possible. To understand how this became possible, we have to recognize a recurring pattern in modern power. When institutions feel constrained by law, they don't usually attack the law directly. They sidestep it. Over the last 2 decades, we've seen a steady expansion of executive discretion under the language of emergency, national security, foreign threats, exceptional circumstances. Each time, the justification sounds temporary. Each time, the authority becomes permanent. The legal architecture is familiar. Move fast. Act first. Explain later. Courts are treated not as co-equal branches, but as obstacles to be managed. Jurisdiction becomes a technical inconvenience. Distance becomes a tool. Once people are removed from judicial reach, the argument shifts. Not we violated the law, but the law is no longer practical. This is how systems erode, not through coups, but through logistics. The current case did not emerge in a vacuum. It is the product of years of normalizing exception after exception until exception becomes routine. And then, inevitably, the routine breaks, triggering the first real crisis. The first real rupture came when the court drew a clear line. A federal judge ordered the planes grounded. Jurisdiction was asserted. Due process was no longer abstract, it was operational. And that is when the system revealed its true posture. The flights did not stop. The transfers continued. Judicial authority was treated as optional. This was not confusion, it was defiance. When a court order is ignored, the issue is no longer procedural. It becomes constitutional. Contempt is not a technical word. It describes a moment when power decides that law no longer applies to it. At that point, the case stopped being about detainees. It became about whether court orders still mean what we think they mean. The judge responded the only way the judiciary can, by escalating probable cause for criminal contempt, a warning shot across the bow of the executive branch. If you are paying attention, this is the moment you lean forward. Because when courts are tested and ignored, history tells us what comes next. If this pattern feels familiar, it should. But the most revealing part of this crisis wasn't the defiance itself, it was the justification that followed. What matters most here is not the defiance itself, but the logic used to justify it. The executive branch did not say, "We reject the court." It said something far more dangerous. Compliance is no longer feasible. This is the hidden mechanism. First, people are moved outside judicial reach. Then, geography is reframed as impossibility. Finally, impossibility is presented as inevitability. The language is carefully chosen, fluid, unfolding, changed conditions on the ground. These words are not explanations, they are shields. When a government claims it cannot comply with due process because of circumstances it created, accountability dissolves. Cause and consequence are separated. Responsibility floats. This is how systems protect themselves when law becomes inconvenient. Not by denying rights outright, but by postponing them indefinitely. Due process in this framework becomes a promise without a timeline. And a promise without a timeline is not a right, it is a delay tactic. Once delay is normalized, the question quietly shifts. Not whether rights exist, but whether they can ever be exercised. And it is precisely at this point that a second, deeper crisis begins to form. The second crisis emerged when delay turned into doctrine. The court demanded a plan, not rhetoric, not excuses. A plan. How would 137 people receive due process? The response was telling: 7 more days. Not to act, but to think. The government argued that conditions had changed dramatically. Yet it could not explain how, or who was in control, or what had become of the people at the center of the case. This is the moment when legal ambiguity becomes moral risk. If a state claims control, it claims responsibility. If it claims instability, it claims ignorance. Here, it attempted both. The judge allowed the extension but imposed a deadline, a hard date. Either return the detainees or provide hearings that meet constitutional standards. This was not judicial flexibility. It was judicial containment. Because courts understand something, executives often forget. Delay is power, and unchecked delay is abuse. What happens next will determine whether deadlines still restrain authority or merely decorate defiance. But while institutions clash at the top, the real weight of this conflict falls elsewhere. Now, I want you to think about this from where you stand. Not as a legal observer, not as a partisan, but as a person who lives under the assumption that rights are real. Imagine being removed from a system where you can speak, appeal, and be seen into one where time stretches without answers. No courtroom, no timeline, no certainty. This is what happens when due process becomes negotiable. You may tell yourself this is distant, that it affects others, that it's exceptional. But rights do not disappear all at once. They erode at the edges where attention is weakest. If the law can be paused for them, it can be paused again and again until temporary becomes normal. This is why your attention matters, not outrage attention. Because systems change when silence is mistaken for consent. If you believe that constitutional limits should apply even when it's inconvenient, stay with this story. What happens next will not just define them. It will define the boundary of your own protections. And when those boundaries shift, the effects are never confined to one country. What unfolds here does not stop at national borders. When a powerful state redefines due process as optional, others take note, not because they admire it, but because it lowers the cost of imitation. Extraditions become leverage, detention becomes bargaining. Jurisdiction becomes a commodity traded across borders. This is how legal norms decay internationally, not through declarations, but through precedent. Allies grow uneasy. Adversaries grow opportunistic because when rules are bent by the strongest actor, the system tilts. You begin to see reciprocal behavior. Delayed hearings, offshore detentions, ambiguous custody arrangements, each justified by exceptional circumstances. The global order depends less on ideals than on predictability. When predictability collapses, power fills the vacuum. And here is the paradox. By weakening due process at home, a state weakens its credibility abroad. It demands legal cooperation while demonstrating legal flexibility. That contradiction does not go unnoticed. What starts as a domestic workaround becomes a signal, one that reshapes how authority is exercised far beyond a single case. And once the signal is sent, the future narrows into a small number of possible paths. From this point forward, the system faces three possible trajectories. The first is restraint. The executive complies. The detainees are returned or meaningfully heard. The court's authority is reaffirmed, not rhetorically, but operationally. This path stabilizes the system, not because it is painless, but because it restores limits. The second path is normalization. Deadlines are met with partial gestures. Procedural substitutes replace substance. Video hearings, administrative workarounds. Due process exists, but in a diluted form. This is the most tempting outcome. It avoids confrontation while quietly lowering standards. And then there is the third path. Defiance hardens. Extensions multiply. Compliance becomes symbolic. Courts issue orders. Executives ignore them. At that point, the crisis is no longer legal, it is constitutional. History shows us this pattern clearly. Systems do not collapse when laws are broken once. They collapse when breaking the law no longer feels exceptional. Which path emerges will not be decided by rhetoric. It will be decided by whether limits are enforced or merely acknowledged. And this brings us to the question that matters most. Here is the insight that ties everything together. Constitutions do not fail when they are attacked. They fail when they are worked around. What you have witnessed is not chaos. It is coordination. A system testing how much delay, distance, and ambiguity it can introduce before limits stop mattering. This case will not be remembered for its legal filings. It will be remembered for what it reveals about power under pressure. Because when due process becomes conditional, rights become fragile. And when rights are fragile, they belong only to those least likely to need them. The question now is not what the executive will claim. It is what the system will tolerate. Courts can issue orders. Judges can set deadlines. But constitutional meaning is ultimately enforced or eroded by follow-through. If you care about where that line is drawn, this story isn't over. It's just entering its decisive phase. Stay engaged. Stay informed. And if you want to understand how these moments reshape the future before headlines catch up, continue this conversation, because the next test is already coming and it won't announce itself.